I was born 87 years ago. For 65 years, I've ruled as Tamriel's emperor. But for all these years, I've never been the ruler of my own dreams.
I have spent an unhealthy amount of time with the Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion. My relationship with it can best be summarized as such.
Flying in the sky, cliff racer fly so high, flying.
It's a messy mix of nostalgia-induced fervor, unbreakable habits, and genuine appreciation for an incredibly unique game. To say Oblivion is flawed is to say I'm autistic for making a multi-part video series on a game from 2006. That is, you're pointing out the painfully obvious. From weird design choices to cookie-cutter dungeons and plenty of bugs and flat quests in between, the faults of Oblivion are numerous, and I'll get to covering as many as I can. But make no mistake, I think this game is fantastic, possibly a masterpiece even, because it's what it gets right that gave me an itch that no game has since come close to scratching. Beneath the flaws, some of which I just find endearing at this point, is an incredible sandbox exploration game that, when everything is going right, or at least not horribly wrong, can be quite immersive and engaging. It's the go anywhere and do anything approach Bethesda took with every aspect of the game's design that it's both its greatest strength and its greatest weakness. In some regards, this was a liberating approach that opened up so many ways of playing Oblivion. And in other ways, it utterly ensures certain parts of the game cannot be enjoyable. Fortunately, the former often outweighs the latter, and with the passage of time I can forgive certain flaws and give credit as in certain respects even Bethesda has yet to match its high points. You got red juice, blue juice, and green juice, which correlate to health, magicka, and fatigue respectively. Combat is intended to be a balance between these resources. There are a multitude of ways to manage your juice levels while depleting it in your enemies. You got a bunch of different weapons, spells, and whatnot to hurt your enemies, and you got access to different spells and potions to keep yourself topped off on your preferred juices. In theory, these juices are supposed to be treated with close to equal regard, but in reality, they are anything but. Health is your most important resource to be kept as high as possible, unless you like to live dangerously. And with the amount of potions you'll be given, there's really no excuse not to be at your max at all times, because you never know when an ogre might come and take you for half your health in one smack. Magicka, if you're a mage, and in all honesty even if you aren't, is your second most important resource, and any spell cast comes at the cost of it. Like health, there's plenty of potions to keep it full, but unlike it, you regenerate it over time. But its regen speed is dictated by many factors, mostly a willpower attribute, so chugging potions is your best bet. Fortunately, since you'll be depleting magicka all the time, get used to having none and waiting for it to regen a lot. Finally, we have fatigue, and it's completely useless. You can just ignore it. Okay, maybe that isn't 100% accurate, but it's close enough to the truth to be the truth. But the fact is, your base recharge rate is 10 points a second, which is usually more than enough to keep you from ever having to resort to chugging potions or using spells to refill it. The damage penalties from ignoring it just aren't enough to justify worrying about it, and the most noticeable effect of having low fatigue is not being able to perform power attacks, which just means you have to back off of swinging for a few seconds as you recover. Take it from me, don't worry about the green juice levels. To the end of making things dead, you have a wide range of options to choose from. You have melee, which lets you smack things, bows that lets you shoot things, and magic, which lets you shoot things with colorful balls of light. And all three can be augmented by stealth for an added bonus, though stealth synergizes particularly well with bows. Melee characters are given a slew of swinging options to choose from that fall into two camps, blade and blunt. Blade slashes, blunt crushes. There's also using your fists, which has its own skill, but this is just not advised for any but the most devout masochists. Blade lets you use daggers, short swords, long swords, and two-handed claymore-type weapons. Blunt lets you use small axes, maces, two-handed war axes, and two-handed warhammers. The difference between these is attack speed and the ability to use a shield. Because you can cast spells at any time regardless of what's in your hands, magic as a secondary form of damage is always an option too. But despite all this, the option only boils down to what model you wish to see occupying the screen space as you smash the attack buttons. Because the difference in playstyles is little to none thanks to the lack of depth in your repertoire of moves and way more A than I in the NPC's AI.
They'll tear right through your armor, too.
He was here a second ago.
You're pathetic.
Bows and arrows suffer even less depth, sad to say, because there's only one type of bow, which is the longbow. You don't get access to any other ranged weapons, and aside from the occasional enchanted arrow that only spawn later in the game and aren't available to be made or purchased, you don't really have much of a choice between the arrows that don't boil down to picking the stack of arrows that do the most damage. Stealth plays to your advantage here because when sneaking you get a 3 times damage multiplier from your sneak attacks. But the only variation in combat from this is just positioning yourself more carefully and moving through dungeons even slower as you stare into the murky ambient light looking for shapes of enemies ahead. It really doesn't add much to the experience, I have to admit. It's more engaging than melee for sure, and when your enemies spot you it will require some finesse to maintain your positional advantage, but with the limitations of the movement system, what you end up doing to keep that advantage often feels like a cheesing tactic more than anything else. And the AI rarely knows how to compensate and will start to just bug out as a result, adding to this cheese factor. Then we come to magic, which is by far my favorite of the 3. Like I said earlier, you can cast spells regardless of what's in your hands. It's just a simple button tap to fire off a spell. So you can keep an axe or a sword or a bow in your hand, a shield in the other, and still pop off spells, making it so that you really don't have to choose between magic and other damage types. What does limit you is your magicka pool and your magicka recharge rate. And when your higher damage spells start to burn a ton of magicka, it will slowly relegate your spells to little more than a cheap form of spitball damage or a quick heal and time for you to reposition and recover. Unless, that is, if you go all in for magic and try to specialize and build for it. Oblivion has a surprisingly unique and varied magic system, considering the other 2 systems are dull and even duller. Your main modes of damage are fire, frost, and electric elements. And aside from some characters that have very high resistances to certain forms of damage, there's no need to overthink this. Damage types do not synergize. You can't stack 2 effects to make them more potent or anything. It just boils down to, does the game tell you this enemy is immune to this damage type? No? Okay, fire at will. You're also given 2 types of attack mode, target and touch. Target lets you fire off from a distance at the expense of more expensive to cast spells. Touch requires you to get up close and personal, but the spells cost less, so you could afford more damaging spells. This compromise is great for melee characters who will be in their enemy's face anyway, making the sting of not being able to specialize in magic hurt less by letting them make better use of their limited magicka pool. Neat. You're also given a 3rd factor to consider, and that's range. No, not that range. This range. You can get spells or make them yourself that does damage over a large distance, allowing you to fire off a spell that will hit multiple targets or a whole room. Very nice, very effective, and very fucking expensive. Usually not advised, but it's great to have options. And finally you have duration, which, as the name might suggest, allows you to make damage over time spells. Duration plays more of a prominent role with utility spells, but it works with damage spells too. And that leads into the different types of magical effects, because magic has so much more going for it than the other 2. We aren't even scratching the surface yet. Effect types fall into 3 categories: Drain, Damage, and Absorb. Drain will only temporarily lower the affected juice attribute or skill. So a damage intelligence spell will lower the target's intelligence attribute down, say, 10 points, making it 40 instead of 50. Once the duration of the spell, say 20 seconds elapses, the target's intelligence goes back to 50. If it's health, then it drops to 40, and once the spell is done, the health will go back up 10 points. So if you did 10 points of damage during the duration of the spell, the target's health goes back up to 40, not 50. Damage health is fine if you can kill the target in the time window, otherwise it's sort of a waste. But it's also the cheapest of the 3 types of spells to cast, so it has its benefits. The second effect type, damage, is what we know a lot more intrinsically. You hit the enemy with the effect, and the only way to undo the effect is with a restorative effect of equal magnitude. You hit an enemy with damage health 10 points, they gotta chug a potion to heal those 10 points back. If that effect has a duration, it will do that damage multiplied by the duration. So 10 damage over 5 seconds comes out to 50 points of damage. Very nice. This is more expensive than Drain, but it's a one and done deal, no worrying about it being reversed at the end of the spell. Third is Absorb, which is like damage, but transfers those points to you instead. Absorb health 10 points takes 10 health from your target and heals you 10 points. Simple but costly, and falls under the School of Restoration rather than the other two damage types, which are Destruction. So you need to pay more in Magic and specialize in another School of Magic too. Then we get into elements, weaknesses, and resistances, and all this other shit that doesn't really end up mattering a whole lot. Like I said earlier, as long as your enemy isn't totally immune to the damage type you're dealing, you're probably okay. Unless you're playing on a very high difficulty or doing a very autistic challenge run, in which case a lot of what I'm saying is obvious or inapplicable. You can also damage enemy attributes and skills, which I don't know if it even really has an effect. I've never even seen enemies run out of magicka. I mean, they probably do, but the problem is that the AI doesn't account for any of this, and their behavior thus doesn't change as a result. If you deplete a mage's magicka, they just whip out a dagger and charge at you like a total psychopath, and your response is the same as before, splash him with more spells until dead. Unless you're doing a special sort of run where you limit your offensive measures, the most effective move 99.9% of the time is just hit him until he's dead. It's a shame this is the case because Bethesda built a very interesting system of skills and attributes, and it would be awesome to exploit that system and really tear apart your enemies, but the dummy AI just makes that more trouble than it's worth. This leads into utility spells that can manipulate enemy behavior like Turn Undead, Frenzy, Calm, and Fear spells, but their utility is limited and only prolongs the inevitable of having to whack, burn, or shoot them to death. Paralyze and Silence are fun and useful blights you can inflict upon your foes, but other than that, trying to make use of any of the other utility spells yields middling results at best, and at worst wastes precious magicka that could be used instead to make your enemies dead. Making enemy dead is most important in a fight. Believe it or not, I've only covered 3 of the magic skills thus far: Destruction, Restoration, and Illusion. There are 6, although Mysticism is a little, special. Conjuration can summon enemies to kill your enemies for you and act as aggro magnets while you sit in the corner dealing damage against distracted foes. It also lets you summon weapons and armor, which is, okay? It feels like an afterthought, but it's there, I guess. Alteration lets you cast spells that protect you from damage and elements, which can be useful against certain enemies. Alteration is fine if you want to sit and prepare and really think about an encounter, but it's sort of pointless when, once again, the best way to approach a fight is stacking as much damage in as possible. Mysticism lets you dispel drain effects, see living creatures in the dark, trap souls for enchanting, and use telekinesis to move certain objects. Dispel can come in handy when you get hit with something like drained strength, which will suddenly make all that sweet loot in your bag too heavy to carry, leaving you glued in place. Detecting life is useful for stealth characters because you can see enemies through walls, but once your sneak level is high enough, the risks of detection are so low that you can literally walk into enemies and be fine. Soul trapping is essential for enchanting, but you can slap that on a weapon via an enchantment. Telekinesis is just utterly useless. Mysticism ends up being a grab bag of spells that ultimately are never essential and winds up leaving the school feeling a little bit pointless. With that, I think it's safe to say we finished discussing magic, which has a ton of things for you to design very unique builds with some insane amounts of variation, and because you can mix and match things to your liking, the options are almost limitless. What ends up playing against you as a magic character is not your options or your imagination, but the AI itself, which just takes a lot of the fun out of all the experimentation. I've always wanted to do some crazy magic builds, but just never did it because the cardboard AI is always quicker to dispatch with some basic fireball spells than anything else. It's like spending your whole life training to be a martial arts master only to get shot in the head by some kid with a gun because bullet beats fist. It's nice though that the game doesn't punish you for mixing magic in with melee and bows because it's such a fun system to tinker with. To further spread the joy, you also have alchemy and enchanting to open up more options.
This had better be good. Oh my goodness. Excuse me, are you all right? Run away! What's the matter? Getting tired.
Alchemy lets you use a lot of the magic system in bottle form. You can apply poisons to weapons to utilize offensive effects, or you can harness the positive effects in potions. There's a ton of ingredients to collect that can be mixed up to create very unique, sometimes questionable effects. This is a system I always feel guilty not interacting with more, even though I slap it onto just about every character I make. The problem is it's just a cumbersome affair, and carrying a lot of potions is a huge burden and means you don't get to carry nearly as much gear and loot. And once again, like with magic, a lot of the strategy goes out the window when you just can easily carry around a modest stack of health potions and stand there swinging at your enemy as you chug them while waiting for your enemy to fall over first. It removes the need to experiment, and because of that I never really do. Enchanting, like alchemy, allows non-magic characters to tinker with magic or to add even more synergy to mages. You can add effects to weapons that will consume charges each time the weapon deals damage, and for a lot of builds, this will be your main way to scale up your damage output as you gain higher levels. You can find enchanted weapons as dungeon loot, so you don't actually have to enchant them yourself, or you can get them from quests, or you can make them with sigil stones from Oblivion gates, making the harvesting of sigil stones really one of the only reasons to close gates. Some of those stones are no joke and can make more powerful enchantments than the alternative way permits. In order to recharge a weapon, you need to either consume soul gems of Ardless Stone or bring it to a vendor who will, for a modest sum of gold, charge it for you. You can also apply enchantments to equipment which will grant buffs, or debuffs if that's your thing, and won't need to be recharged either. Very cool. Enchanting costs gold, requires knowledge of the spell, and a certain skill level in the appropriate school of magic in order to apply it to the item. The level of the soul gem dictates the potency of the enchantment, and for weapons it will dictate the number of charges. You can stack the effects on weapons, but this will come at the cost of fewer total charges, while items can only have one effect applied. It's a cool system and I love using and abusing it to its full potential. I do have a personal gripe with the limited number of charges being way too low in the vanilla game, so I do use a mod that boosts it up a little bit, so I'm not recharging it every time I clear a single dungeon. To round things off, there's also enchanted staves that behave like spells, but use weapon charges instead of magicka. They're a nice backup for mages who aren't using a weapon, but because staves are two-handed and won't allow you to equip anything else with them, their utility is limited for a lot of characters. There's also spell scrolls that allow one-time casting of the respective spell they are tied to. The problem with both staves and scrolls is that they aren't craftable or customizable, you just find them as loot, and as such, they always feel like a secondary thing and not something that can be relied upon as a primary means of dealing damage. But now I think we can leave magic totally behind, and offensive combat mechanics entirely, and go into defenses. Because while your main goal is to make things dead, your second goal in combat is to keep yourself from being made dead. To that end, you got a bunch of armors to choose from, classified as either heavy or light. Heavy armor protects more but weighs more and slows you down more, while light offers less protection but weighs less and slows you down less. But don't worry, you will eventually unlock perks that let you negate the downsides of each armor class. Heavy armor becomes weightless and light armor becomes 50% more effective, making it so that you're really only picking the armor based on aesthetics at this point. If you're a mage, you can wear armor too, but be warned, your spells will be less effective. This can be mitigated by leveling up your skill in the respective armor class, but it will always be there. If you want the most bang for your magicka buck, then you have to go with wearing all cloth, which has no spell penalty. The loss of armor can be made up by wearing something with a shield enchantment on it, and it won't impact your spell effectiveness. I really like how this encourages glass cannon builds that can be a lot of fun to play. In order to augment your defense, you can also equip a shield, which is also classified under the respective armor classes. This allows you to block more effectively, increase your armor rating, and have another piece of equipment to enchant. And that more or less covers defensive options, aside from my favorite, which is running and jumping around like a total spaz so enemies can't hit you. But now it's time to criticize. Despite all the options and variety to choose from, it all ends up feeling the same. The bulk of your time in Oblivion's combat will be spent wagging a sword and smacking a straw dummy, or slinging a bolt of elemental damage at a dummy, or shooting an arrow at a dummy. Regardless of your preferences for a particular mode of damage, it all ends up feeling the same because combat lacks any sort of weight or feedback. This is probably being a little more harsh than Oblivion deserves, especially considering how much of the combat changed from Morrowind, which relied upon dice rolls in a real-time combat system that only resulted in combat feeling extremely awkward, bordering on broken. In Oblivion, Bethesda managed to push it to just feeling awkward, which is an accomplishment I have to give them credit for. A real limiting factor in this regard is that you can take a hammer and smash a goblin in the face and it will react exactly the same as if you slashed it with a dagger. Which is to say, he won't react at all. He won't flinch, he won't dodge, and unless you're using a power attack, he won't stagger. His options are either run at you swinging wildly, run at you blocking, or some compromise between those two states. And aside from having the option to strafe yourself or block to force him to recoil, your own combat options aren't very broad, and result in you just standing there whacking at your enemy until its HP hits 0 and it crumbles to the floor suddenly dead. There's no weakened or unconscious states, very rarely do enemies attempt to flee or act with any sort of regard for their own life, it's just fight and dead. In the beginning stages of the game, combat is a drag because your options are so limited. As you gain levels, you unlock more of your build's potential and things start to get fun. But that almost always tapers off as the world continues to level up and you crest the curve of your combat effectiveness. You don't face smarter enemies, you just start fighting enemies whose health and damage output values are a few points higher. Meanwhile, your own damage output gains are stagnant. But it is all starting to lead into a different discussion, so it's probably about time we switch gears to discuss leveling. I was coming from the background of a RuneScape addict when I got this game in 2006. This is important because RuneScape is all about the dopamine drip feed from constant progression, and Oblivion has, well, an interesting take on progression. Not so much a drip feed, and more like starvation for a few hours, and then a diesel-spiked injection of progression crack that has you going from wearing chainmail to glass in one game session. I don't know how I didn't ruin the game for myself back then, because I was still at the stage where I thought doing shit like this was the best way to level up. Let's just say my problem-solving skills were still in development. I was used to job simulators that had more grinding than gameplay, and bringing that into Oblivion isn't advised. Fortunately, I spent most of my time running around the world and crawling through dungeons, so I managed to accidentally save the experience before I overleveled my character and destroyed the game. Before I explain how you can manage to overlevel in a game where leveling and character progression are one of the pillars of its design, I need to introduce character creation and leveling mechanics. The beginning of Oblivion has you learning the mechanics of the game in a surprisingly engaging sequence of sewer crawling. During this sequence, you build up your familiarity with a lot of what the game has to offer before finally settling on what your character will be. Or you just make a save a few steps from the sewer exit so you can skip the whole thing when you inevitably make 30 more characters after. Everything is up to you to choose. The game will make a suggestion based off your style of play during the tutorial, but you can tell Boris he doesn't know shit and make your own class, or choose from one of the other pre-made ones. Now, a character build works like this. You got 3 specializations: Combat, Magic, and Stealth. These influence starting skills, skill leveling speed, and starting attributes. Then you select 2 of the 7 major attributes, ideally ones that synergize with your main skills because you want to focus on leveling the main skills you'll be using the most. Then you pick your 7 major skills. Once again, you'll want to pick what will synergize with your attributes, because when you level up those 7 major skills, you get points to your actual character level up. The minor skills will not contribute to your character skill progression, but they can still be leveled up, albeit more slowly. But that doesn't make leveling them useless, and here's why. Minor skills still contribute to your attribute leveling progress. Okay, I'm sure more than a few of you watching this have played the game, because who else cares about it at this point? I'm going to pretend you didn't, or more likely, didn't know this because it's never actually explained and isn't obvious in the slightest. When you level up and sleep in a bed, you get to pick 3 attributes to level up. Ideally, you pick 3 that will complement your build the most and contribute to its combat effectiveness. Each attribute does something different. Strength increases melee damage and carry weight, intelligence increases your mana pool, and so on and so forth. The only one I level on every character is speed, because doing so enables you to achieve land speed record-breaking sprints, and even more game-breaking jump distances. But you see those little numbers next to each attribute? That's how much it will increase by when you select it, so you want to prioritize the higher numbers if you can help it. How do you get more pluses? Level up skills in those attributes, even if they are minor skills. So really, if you want to be the most optimized, you'll level up a ton of minor skills governed by your preferred attributes to get maximum +5 every level up. But if you're min-maxing this hard in Oblivion Sun, you got problems and the 3 +5s ain't gonna fix them. To recap, we picked our specialization, our attributes, and our major skills. Oh, did I mention your race and gender also impact your stats? Because they do, which is why I almost always go with the Swiss Army knife Dark Elves. They kinda can do anything and their bonuses are all unuseful skills, so there's no wasted potential here. But don't despair, those stats are washed out rather quickly once you've leveled up some, so don't feel bad about making an orc mage. Oh, and don't forget to pick your birth sign. There's very little reason to go for something that isn't the thief, mage, or warrior, since all 3 just apply useful skill bonuses. But there's a couple in there that are useful, I suppose, and the chat atronach can be very, very special to play. But wait, I hear you asking. You still haven't explained how leveling can be a bad thing in Oblivion. And to answer that, I gotta introduce what quite a few people, or at least a very vocal group, consider to be the main antagonist of Oblivion: global level scaling. So when you level up, not only do you get incrementally more powerful, so do your enemies. Enemies get just a little more powerful, gain a bit more health, and you'll face scarier variants after certain thresholds are crossed. Trolls are replaced by ogres, minotaurs are replaced by minotaur lords, scamps are replaced by the masters of stunlock and clan fears, along with many other cast changes. Also, bandits will begin equipping higher level gear, and you'll find better gear and higher leveled potions, scrolls, soul gems, and ingredients in dungeon chests. The theory for this design choice was that it removed limitations on players, because that is, in my humble opinion, the truly defining feature of Oblivion. Bethesda didn't want to tell the players no. Want to walk all the way to Anvil on the other side of the map once you leave the tutorial sewers? Enjoy the walk. Want to go and join one of the guilds? Sure. Want to do what I usually do and go straight to the arena to level up a few times to make the beginning hours of the game less of a drag and get enough money to buy the starter shack on the waterfront? Go right ahead. Things like level scaling were only the symptoms of the actual problem hurting this game. Player freedom is, in fact, the cause. The symptoms were the price we paid for all this freedom, all this glorious power, and I intend on covering all those symptoms. Just remember, they aren't the real problem. But let's start investigating level scaling. See, in a lot of other RPGs, the world is not level scaled. Certain regions are harder than others, while other places become so easy there's no reason to revisit them. It's a different approach, but Bethesda didn't want to say no. They want to maximize player freedom, and that freedom, first and foremost, begins with freedom of navigation. And I'm personally glad they went this route. I would have not sunk nearly as many hours into this game otherwise. I guess this makes me one of those filthy casuals that a lot of people blame for ruining the franchise. Look, I get bored easily because I got a scattered form of attention, and that makes me very intolerant to having to do the exact same thing over and over. When I start up a game like Mass Effect or Dragon Age, the opening few hours are almost identical each time. Eventually the game opens up, but it takes a few hours, and sometimes those few hours are enough to turn me away and towards a game like Oblivion where I'll be up and running in a few minutes if I have that handy save just before the sewer exit. What ends up happening is we pay that back over the long run. Because if everything's scaling, then challenge remains constant, well, in theory. In practice, the difficulty curve can either slope down or slope up, depending on the build you make, and that's not an obvious thing unless you've sunk the ungodly amount of time that I have into this game. I know stealth characters get progressively easier to play until they literally break the game because they can completely ignore combat. How close can I actually get by? Oh, okay. And I know melee characters are pretty much doomed because melee damage is capped by things like skills, attributes, gear, and enchantments, which are all finite thanks to caps. Magic characters land somewhere in the middle, but a pure mage will generally find the game gets a little easier, especially when they start stacking spell absorption and willpower buffing gear that will make mana regen a non-issue. But you can pretty much expect the difficulty to remain relatively static unless you start fucking with the difficulty slider, which there's no shame in doing if it gives you a few more hours of enjoyment. This means that in terms of gameplay, a lot of it starts to feel the same, especially when your builds start doing what you were designing them to do. In essence, Oblivion begins to break itself if you play it intelligently. Unless we do something that would violate every sensibility a seasoned and novice RPG player alike would possess. Ignore leveling up. This is the thing I realized in recording this video when I was doing the main quest and had to run through a dozen Oblivion gates. If you don't want more challenging Daedra to spawn, just don't level up. You can keep collecting gear and leveling up skills still provide some bonuses, but if you're not leveling up, then the world isn't leveling up. We could take this a step further, which is what big brain problem solver me back in 2007 accidentally did. If you don't make your combat skills your major skills, then you will never level up from combat. This will let you control your leveling to such a degree that you can maximize those attribute points too. Rather than doing a smart build like I did for this character, go with things you'll never actually use, like speechcraft, mysticism, and armor. The problem with this approach is twofold. First off, the skills you really need and want will be leveling up slower, especially painful for your slower leveling combat skills like blade, destruction, and marksman. That's going to hurt you in the early game, but hey, if the enemies aren't leveling up and you're still managing to get by with better gear and superior tactics, then you're probably okay. The second problem is, this is fucking boring. I don't want to make a build that is a literal inverse of my playstyle. Fortunately, you don't actually have to do this because we have a difficulty slider. The difficulty slider, which can be changed at any time, can be used to tweak down or crank up the difficulty. That's probably the best way to handle the level scaling in Oblivion. It really is a mess, and I didn't realize just how bad it was until I played this character, which is all stealth. I almost always play mages, which, like I said earlier, can have a very easy time or a not so easy time depending on the circumstances, so I never quite noticed all the issues Oblivion is played with thanks to its level scaling. What the difficulty slider doesn't compensate for is loot spawning. And that I think is the worst aspect of Oblivion's level scaling. The difficulty can be tweaked to your liking, but the fact that the game goes from starving you of gear, gold, and potions to drowning you in all of it once you hit level 15 is something that nothing except the most exceptional metagaming and mods can fix. And this ruined the experience for me pretty quickly this time around. This was also one of the strangest obsessions of mine when I first got the game. Coming off of RuneScape, which is all about inflating your bank account to then sink millions of GP into bling and houses, I guess it makes sense why I came into Oblivion thinking making gold was the most important thing for me to spend my time doing after getting bored grinding levels for no reason. So I'd clear out loot-heavy dungeons and then make a dozen fast travel trips to strip all the gear out and sell it at the market district. I did this for every dungeon I hit, and considering I spent most of my time clearing dungeons, it starts to paint a sad and troubling picture. But I did get the bling in the houses. Of course, making money, especially at higher levels, is laughably trivial, because lowly bandits at remote camps will be geared with enough high-level armor to buy half the player-owned houses in the game. And aside from buying houses, which is pretty much useless because the Waterfront Shack gives you all the perks any of the base game houses will give you, which is a bed to sleep in and a chest to store your shit, there aren't any money sinks in the game. Maybe repairing armor and recharging magic weapons are two other sinks, but they barely count. Barring the Blade of Woe, which was a woe on my coin purse thanks to a mod that boosts enchanted weapons' number of charges, Recharging that gold-thirsty dagger cost more than the Skingrad house, and I didn't realize until I was flat broke, so I ditched the gold sucker for something else and started stripping dungeons for an hour until I was the richest man in Brazil. The easy loot never bothered me when I was younger, but this recent playthrough I found it almost killed my interest entirely. I don't really know why. Maybe I used to really enjoy the progression of this game and I just happened to make a character that really cheesed the hell out of the game too much. Maybe because I just finally noticed how absurd it is. Maybe because the older I get, the more I appreciate scarcity of experiences as opposed to constant indulgence. And I mean, that philosophy can be applied to just about anything, not just games. We value things that are scarce, whether it be loot in Oblivion, money in our bank accounts, sex, or drugs. We need to understand the plight of being without in order to appreciate having those things. And we need constant reminders of how great having those things are, otherwise we lose that appreciation over time. With all that said, do I hate level scaling and wish it gone? No, not really. I wish it was toned down some, but I still appreciate the freedom it enables me to have in this game, even if it creates some ugly and weird contrivances as a result. Really what I think would make this game better was if the level scaling was more subtle. There's a soft level cap around level 50, but the best gear starts spawning in the world by level 20, with everything being out there by 25, and it doesn't take long to reach 25. You can easily hit 60 hours in the base game if you're blasting through all of its content and doing some exploration on the side. By 60 hours you'll be near level 40-45 just by organically leveling, which is why level grinding is just so stupid. That means you haven't seen any new gear or enemies in 20 to 30 levels, or 20 to 30 hours because each level is about an hour by that point. But I think that's enough harping on level scaling. The fact is, Bethesda has made 3 more games since Oblivion, and all of them have had level scaling playing a central role of their design. And I think, especially in Fallout 4, Bethesda managed to strike a balance where its seams are not so apparent. It's here to stay, and I'm fine with that if it lets me continue to play these games with as much freedom as the design can permit. I'd like to take a moment to look over all 21 skills in Oblivion, as there are some notes for certain skills I'd like to make. Honestly, I could make a 40-minute long video on just the skills in this game, because it's a very broad subject and there's such a gradient of quality in these skills that makes some of them almost universally essential and others universally useless. But let's just compress that down to a few minutes and call it a day. In total there are 21 skills in Oblivion, 7 for each of the major 3 specializations. For combat skills we have Blade, Blunt, Hand-to-Hand, Armor, Block, Heavy Armor, and Athletics. For stealth, we have acrobatics, light armor, security, sneak, marksman, mercantile, and speechcraft. And then for magic, there are the 6 schools of magic: illusion, conjuration, mysticism, alteration, and destruction, and then we have alchemy to make the 7. Because I think I've covered enough magic for one video, I'm going to omit those entirely. So that leaves combat, which is a misleading name since all 3 are combat related, and stealth, which is more aptly named but still doesn't quite match up. Blade and Blunt, like I said earlier, are on the surface quite distinct. But when you get down to it, they end up playing almost the same, as there's little to differentiate them later in the game. It boils down to choice aesthetics and little else. Hand-to-hand is nothing but the butt end of every Oblivion joke. You can never really hope to make up the damage output surrendered for not taking a weapon, and even though you unlock some knockback and paralyzing attacks, so too does your weapon-wielding counterparts. Armor is something strange for me. I get what Bethesda was aiming for by making your armor and weapons degrade with use, requiring you to get them fixed from time to time, but their decay rates are pretty absurd, and I'd argue the system only detracts from the game. Armor allows you to use repair hammers to maintain your equipment, which is a tremendous pain in the ass when you have a lower level in the skill, as you'll be constantly breaking hammers. This means you need to devote 20% of your carry weight to just carrying hammers in the early game, when your carry weight is already low and your armor is weighing you down even more. Armor offers little reward aside from giving you some cheap points for your endurance attribute, because leveling armor is very easy and very fast. Other than fixing your gear in the field and those endurance points, it's a worthless skill to have, because you could just as easily get your stuff repaired when you go to town to sell your loot, and the money you make off your sales will almost always be more than your repair bills. So why bother? The same can be said for recharging enchantments on weapons, which ordinarily calls for you to micromanage filling soul gems, when you could just spend a few coins and get it recharged by a vendor. Bethesda swept out the likes beneath these 2 mechanics by having vendors do it more easily and for a bargain price. Because honestly, what are you using that gold for anyway? Well, let's assume vendors couldn't repair items, or they could but their prices were much less reasonable. What fun is there in such a system? It adds to the immersion, I suppose. But considering the game has a million beds and even more food items but never makes you eat or sleep is more jarring. Or the fact that it can stand in one spot and wait for several days with 0 consequences. They chose not to implement that though because it would inhibit player freedom. There are plenty of players who want those features, but from what we've already discussed so far, it looks like Bethesda wasn't trying to appeal to those players. So why did Armor make the cut? My guess is they needed something to round out the skills of combat to act as the seventh. So they made equipment durability management a skill. What this would have ended up doing is forcing almost every player who wants to use weapons or armor to have armor as a skill. And having a skill that every player really must pick in order to have an ideal experience is a contradiction of the design philosophy of Oblivion. So they let vendors do it for you, nullifying the skill in the process. Armor really underlines the slippery slope Bethesda stumbled down when it came to making Oblivion more accessible. Once they set down that path, there were other concessions that had to be met in order to make an experience true to that paradigm. And before we know it, we have a skill that was rendered inert before we even hit the end of the sewers. It's no wonder they dropped it for blacksmithing in Skyrim, which, well, that's a whole different story for a whole different video, I suppose. Athletics is another skill that I suspect exists just because they needed something to round out the 7 skill requirements they set for themselves. The only thing that more levels in athletics lets you do is recover more points of fatigue as you're running, which, as I said earlier about green juice, isn't really a factor at all and can be safely ignored. So having a skill whose sole purpose is to help with that makes the skill completely useless. Acrobatics, on the other hand, has more to offer in that you'll be able to jump higher and eventually unlock abilities like dodge, roll, and defy Newtonian physics by being able to jump off of the surface of water. Still not a skill even worth considering specializing in, but if you bunny hop all the time while playing, you don't need to select it anyway. Doing so with any character will let you level up your speed attribute, which makes you run faster. Make no mistake, that is indispensable for any character you play. Light armor I already went into, and as I've already said, your choice between light and heavy armor really comes down to preference, and aligning your build to as few attributes as possible so you can focus on maxing them out more. Security is another skill I've always had major gripes with. At the risk of getting into a much bigger argument about the unnecessarily rigid structure a lot of RPG leveling mechanics are, I want to say I don't like skills whose sole focus is to unlock optional things. Be it lockpicking, hacking, or speech skills, I hate them because when I see them I'm led to think either the game is going to have an abundance of content I won't get access to unless I pick these skills, or that content will have other ways to access it because the developers realize that punishing players who don't want to sacrifice combat effectiveness for exploration isn't a fair thing to do. Like I said, this is an argument well beyond the scope of this video, so I'm forced to oversimplify it a lot. But I feel the security skill adds nothing to the game. And what's worse is that the mini-game that's attached to it is so obtuse and tedious that I just get as many lockpicks as I can, sometimes resorting to cheating to get them, just so I can smash the auto attempt button until I'm through. The fact that they added the skeleton key, which is an unbreakable lockpick you get from a very easy quest at level 10, leads me to believe that Bethesda was aware of this issue too, or at least were willing to compromise. If security tied into other gameplay elements, I'd be more willing to cut it some slack. But it doesn't, so I don't. Ban it, get it out of here, give me my skeleton key. I love this sound, don't you? Next is Sneak. Sneak is a great concept held back by 2006 Bethesda AI and a healthy heap of dumbing down to boot. Once again, this is a subject that can easily be stretched into a video, but to make a long point short, the stealth mechanics of Oblivion leave a lot to be desired. NPCs are either telepathic in how they can sense the disturbances you cause in the psychosphere when you enter a room.
Where are you? Huh? Well, whatever it was, it's gone now. Huh? Hello, who's there?
Or are legally blind, all depending on your skill in Sneak. There was never really a middle ground in my playthrough as a Sneak character where it felt fair and challenging, but how absurdly game-breaking it gets at the high end of the level spectrum leads me to prefer the lower level Sneak experience. There's also the problem with guards who can detect a bad deed being done from across town, which is a shockingly harsh response in a game that is in every other aspect trying to be super forgiving. Oblivion is just riddled with poor design choices, bad balancing, and even worse AI that makes Sneak a difficult gameplay path to recommend. Though sneaking through boring quest dungeons was a godsend for making this video, so maybe it's not all bad. Marksman I already discussed, there's not much left to say. It needs more weapons to flesh it out, and while sniping enemies is insanely gratifying, micromanaging tiny stacks of 1 billion arrows is not. Leveling your skill lets you do more damage with them and unlock some nifty skills like being able to inexplicably zoom with some magical ADS wizardry. It's fun, I highly recommend it. This just leaves Mercantile and Speechcraft, saving the worst for last, I suppose. Mercantile is intended to get you better deals from vendors, while Speechcraft is intended to be used to persuade NPCs to do things for you. The underlying problem with Mercantile is there's hardly any use for gold in the game aside from buying houses, repairing or recharging equipment, making custom spells and enchantments, and the occasional bribe for NPCs.
It's just what I wanted. See? Was that hard?
The economy of the game is just entirely unbalanced, mostly due to the fact that doing dungeon crawls, particularly dungeons filled with human enemies, is just absurdly lucrative. Who cares about getting a couple hundred extra gold on the enchanted dagger when you manage to get 3 off of the vampires in a single dungeon? You'll almost never be wanting for cash after the first few hours of the game. And Mercantile isn't going to be what pulls you out of poverty. It's a shame because it's not a half-bad skill otherwise, as it comes with some nice perks like being able to invest in a shop so that they have more cash to buy your loot, and being able to sell any item to any shop. Speechcraft, on the other hand, is a terrible skill with terrible perks attached to the worst minigame in any game I've ever played. The whole skill is built around a minigame that has you picking one of 4 options with varying degrees of effectiveness based on the NPC. You get an idea how they will react based on their awkward facial expressions when hovering over the option. What makes this absurd minigame even more fallacious is the fact that you must exhaust all 4 options every time. Every time an option is selected, the effectiveness meter rotates clockwise, so you want the meter to land on the thing they like the most to maximize the points earned. So you stand there cycling between joking, boasting, flattering, and threatening your target until you get what you want. Then again, judging by some of the NPC conversations in this game, this really might be how they approach discourse in Cyrodiil.
Last night, I heard someone scream from inside. Bellman Benares will never sell that death trap. Take care.
Bye.
Hail.
What is it now?
Heard any news from the other provinces?
Nothing I'd like to talk about.
Bye.
There's more plaguing the speech system in this game than just a laughably uncanny minigame, though. The main problem is that characters' disposition towards the player is rarely an obstacle, unless you need a certain threshold to progress in a quest. It's just so arbitrary that it will pop up like a drunk driving checkpoint on the 4th of July weekend just to remind you it exists. That's when you ignore the minigame entirely, and just like in real life, bribe the shit out of the person until they give you what you want. I don't know if Bethesda intended on making some sort of social commentary with this shortcut, but I like to pretend so. And bribing is only a last resort, because the better alternative is to use charm spells that can boost an NPC's disposition temporarily. You can make a custom charm spell that will boost their disposition by a staggering amount, and make it last 1 second because conversations freeze time. And then just never worry about speechcraft again. And don't worry, you won't be missing anything.
We understand each other perfectly. Oh, well, that's just the thing. I appreciate the gesture. Every little bit helps.
And that's all I have to say about leveling and skills that can fit comfortably in a coherent video. The systems running under the hood of Oblivion are a lot deeper than I think a number of its fans and critics actually give Bethesda credit for. The problem is not the depth, but the effectiveness and meaning of these systems. The game wants to encourage you to make playstyle choices, but it never actually forces you to commit, and offers a ton of ways to get just about anything done, rendering a lot of your choices sort of meaningless. And even when you do make choices and do commit, the game fails to give satisfying feedback a lot of the time. NPC AI doesn't necessitate or even encourage experimenting with these systems to make dynamic builds, and as such your best course of action in combat is laying on maximum damage, as opposed to coming up with tactics to outsmart and exploit your opponents. Many skills fall prey to the game rendering them redundant, either through making easier alternatives to investing in the skills, or letting you throw money around like a Gilded Age political boss. And failing all of that, eventually you just get too good with certain skills, or the reverse happens, and you are eventually overtaken by the constantly leveling world that renders your power advantages less and less relevant. This video is so much longer than I originally had planned. I wanted to insert exploration into this, but then I realized I never discussed the skills and I had to go back and edit it in, and well, now it looks like I'll just have to add another video into the queue. This is a series though, and I plan on covering every aspect of the game. Exploration, presentation, world building, all the guilds, shrines, main story, the DLC, and maybe a few other topics shoehorned in where I can fit them. It's going to be a wild ride, and if you're interested in watching this madness ensue, consider subscribing. I've been working on this project for almost 2 months as of writing this script. This is the 5th script I've written, hitting a total of 40,000 words across all the versions, every script written from scratch. It's been an exhausting gauntlet as I searched for the right balance of tone and content. I hope I finally found something that actually works. If you like this, please consider dropping a comment or a like or sharing it with people or making a sacrifice to Sithis. The support would go a long way to helping me come to terms with what my life has been these past 2 months. and give me steam to press on to finish this thing. I expect by the end of this I will write close to another 40,000 words, which would actually mean I would have written enough words to encompass a whole adult fiction novel across all my scripts. Anyway, have a good one, and I'll see you in the next.